Just to let you know that we have asked the technicians here to slightly turn up the temperature in the room. So if it's too much, you just have to take something off. The next speaker I'm going to introduce is Franklyn Sills. Not everybody here is a craniosacral therapist or a psychotherapist or a polarity therapist, so not everybody will perhaps know of Franklyn's work. So I'll just say a few things. Franklyn is the co-founder of the Karuna Institute in Devon, which offers craniosacral trainings and core process psychotherapy trainings. He is also the co-founder of the Craniosacral Therapy Educational Trust in London, which is the school that I founded and have worked together with him on since many years ago. Franklyn has made a significant contribution to particularly my field of craniosacral work, bringing together many, many strands of understanding in terms of how the body, the mind, and energy interconnect and function as a unified whole. I've had the great pleasure of knowing Franklyn for more than 20 years now and working with him over this time. The other thing that I just want to say is that for me it's also just a wonderful thing to be able to say to you that not only has he been a wonderful colleague during this 20 years, he's also been a true friend. And so it gives with great personal warmth that I invite Franklyn up onto the stage to give the next presentation.
Can I sit down now? Hello, everyone. Hello. Whenever I find myself in this kind of situation where I have such a brief time and a brief opportunity to meet you somehow, my mind tends to go still. And sometimes that's very useful and sometimes not. And I always find that I never know where to start. I have this whole presentation plotted out, but I never know where to start because life is not linear. And certainly I know that my mind can be linear, and I try and get out of that mental set. And as therapists and practitioners, we really do have to get out of that linear mind. And where to start? Where in the world to start with something that is so vast and huge, and yet so beautiful and so extraordinary. What I'd like to do is for us to just sit together for a moment, just to come into a bit of stillness. So if we center ourselves, and for the cranial people, you'll know what, and perhaps the core process people also will know what I mean by when I say come into your fulcrums and settle. And just deepen a moment together. And what I'd like to start orienting us to is the possibility of generating a coherent group field that we can resonate in together. So just settling and deepening. Coming into breath, perhaps. And just noticing what might be in the way of simply being here. And I'll put a little mantra into the field and let the words resonate and settle as they may. Settling, softening, deepening. Just settling under the waveforms, mental activity. Breathing. Settling, softening, deepening. Settling, softening, deepening. And very softly and gently orienting to your heart and heart center, whatever that means for you. And imagining from your sense of midline and the quality of heart-centered listening that you're widening your field of awareness to at least include this whole space we're in. Settling, deepening, and widening. Settling, deepening, widening. As we intend that, all of the beings in this room are in direct relationship. Field to field, presence to presence. What I'd like you to do the next hour and a bit is to simply settle and be in a receptive state and see what resonates, what touches, what confuses, whatever is there for you. And very gently opening your eyes and orienting a bit around the room, just noticing the other beings here. It's very easy to get focused on me. Thank you. So I started this presentation with the word inquiry. I'd like you to all know, and it may be a great relief to some of you, that I really deeply understand that I don't know anything. I mean that. At the depth of who I am, there is a deep recognition that life is deep and it's vast, and my human mentality certainly cannot know it all, and that a certain other kind of knowing is necessary here. A certain other kind of knowing is necessary here that's not linear, it's not analytic, but it's about a knowing of the heart and a knowing of the present moment. And it's about inquiry, that there's nowhere to go. There's nowhere to go. But the inquiry is what's important. The work of Martin Heidegger, people familiar with Martin Heidegger, the philosopher, one of the great philosophers of the 20th century, he wrote in his incredible book, Being in Time, about taking walks through the wood paths, they say in German. Now, those wood paths may not lead anywhere. They may lead to dead ends, but that's not important. What's important is the journey and the inquiry that you took along the path. So I'd like to keep us quite open in that way. It's the only way I can survive, by the way. There we go. In this talk, I'd like to inquire into 3 territories. And I'm calling these territories source, being, and self. And I found myself over these years having my feet in 3 territories. And that's quite a journey because I only have 2 feet. So it has been a bit of a juggling match. And the territories have been this extraordinary work we do, which started way back when in the mid-70s when I was introduced to the human energy system by the work of Dr. Stone, extraordinary healer. And he introduced me, the work introduced me to what he called primary energy, and Sutherland's work in terms of the nature of the organizing forces of the human system at the deepest level. So I've always been interested in that, mostly because of my own suffering. How many of you, I wonder, found your way into a healing profession out of acknowledgement of your own suffering? I'm just wondering that. I'm not alone here, thank God. Yes. Yes. And that's absolutely right, because we have to start with that. We can only start with that. And in knowing my own suffering and what heals, there's a possibility of offering something to someone else, in whatever way I do. And my experience is, the modality is not so important. It's the intentionality and the heartfelt holding that is. Yeah? Have you found that in your work? Yeah. And believe me, I've learned so many bloody modalities over the years that I'm pleased to say that I actually do very little now, which is a great relief. And so I want to start looking at this territory of source, being, and self, these territories, which comes from way back when, a conversation with my wife, Maura, when she had just given a talk at Rigpa, and talked about the territories in Buddhist language of bodhicitta, citta, and atta. Bodhicitta, the already enlightened ground state. Citta, that beingness, that presence which is emergent from that state, which is our birthright. And atta, the self that forms as our most basic sentience meets the conditions of our life. So that made me think a bit about, well, what territories do I trod and what do I want to inquire into, and where is the suffering in my clients when they come to me? And these territories are not separate, they're interdependent, they're co-arising, they're holographic. So I want to start to investigate that. I'm going to start from the bottom, source, being, and then if we have time, inquire a little bit into self, which is a huge topic. So here's something I call the source, being, self axis. And with some tentative definitions, if you like. Source, a numinous ground of emptiness from which being arises and is ever connected. What in the world does that mean? In Buddhism, there's this deep understanding that at the root of all conditions, there is emptiness. But emptiness is a creative principle. If things were not empty and open, nothing could be here. Nothing could take form. At the root of all form, there is that openness and that emptiness, which is the source of all form and holds potential. And our very being coalesces from that form, from that emptiness. Our form coalesces from emptiness. Anyone familiar with the Heart Sutra? Form is emptiness, and emptiness is form, O Shariputra. And Shariputra heard that and was instantly enlightened. It didn't quite happen like that for me. And then there's self. Now, we're going to talk about being in a number of ways later on. We're going to talk about being in terms of Buddhist principles, in terms of Taoist principles, in terms of modern psychology, objects relations theory. What is the nature of being and what is the nature of self? And that's a very interesting inquiry, because we'll discover that at the root of our being, we are not separate. And Ronald Fairbairn, a wonderful analyst, said, the basic drive of a human being is not like Freud's instinctual drives. It was not like we're driven creatures. He said the inherent drive of a human being is to seek relationship with other beings. Because at that level of being, we're not separate. So I'd like to inquire into that. And then self is that which organizes as being meets its world of conditions. That form which is conditioned and conditional, which organizes as being meets its world of conditions. As our soul nature, our spirit, whatever words work for you, meet our world of conditions. But I'd like us to start with a wonderful image that comes from the Hubble telescope. And for people who have been around me, I love the Hubble images, so I use them a lot. Please forgive me. But can we turn these lights down a wee bit, just up here? Is that possible? This is an extraordinary image. We're looking at a star being born. We're looking at Genesis. Is that extraordinary? Isn't it amazing that our technology can allow us to see something that is essentially spiritual at its root? We're seeing a star being born. Oh, goodness gracious. Isn't that extraordinary? And in the cranial field, we talk about the breath of life. Dr. Sutherland used the term the breath of life. Now, we must understand something here. He was not creating a concept. He was attempting to describe his perceptual experience. Yes? When the breath of life truly emerges in a clinical setting, the heart is cast open. And things happen beyond my mentality, beyond anything I could imagine. It's a state of grace. It's rare, but it happens. So when he used the term the breath of life, it wasn't a catchphrase. It was an attempt to describe something, that which connects us to source and mediates the creative intention. And here we have this beautiful image. I'd like to read something from the Tao Te Ching. I once studied with a Chinese, actually I met Mora studying with a Chinese Chan Taoist master a long time ago. That goes back a long time, doesn't it? My goodness. Master Liu, who started teaching us archaic Chinese. If modern Chinese befuddles you, which is certainly befuddles me, archaic Chinese is even more befuddling. But he was extraordinary because he talked about the characters from the essence of his perception. Isn't that a wonderful thing? That's what Dr. Sutherland was doing. So as we look at this amazing image, I'd like us to take a breath and just listen to the words that were written probably 3,500 years ago. Something unformed and complete before heaven and earth were born, preceding all concepts. In other words, our human mentality cannot conceive of this. Preceding all concepts, solitary and silent, standing alone and unchanging, pervading all without limit. It is like the mother of all under heaven, but I don't know its name. Better call it Tao, better call it great. Isn't that wonderful? Naming is useful, but we get very attached to names. Yes? Another wonderful image of light. You know, the currency of the breath of life in our language, in the cranial language, the currency of the breath of life is light and vibration. In some spiritual traditions, they call it light and sound. That through light and vibration and the generation of forces and energies, form is generated. And I'd like to read another quote to you. I just, about a year ago, found this wonderful translation of a Chan master, Hongzi. Hongzi was around the year 1000, 1050. This goes back a ways, isn't it? And Chan is what became in Japan Zen. So Chan is the kind of original Zen. And Hongzi was one of the wonderful masters of the work. So let's take another breath. This is Hongzi. And just look at this image as I speak. His words. The field of boundless emptiness. The field of boundless emptiness is what exists from the very beginning. Vast and far-reaching without boundary. Secluded and pure, manifesting light. This essence is without obstruction. Its brightness does not shine out, but can be called empty and inherently radiant. And in our work, as we deepen and widen and orient to primary respiration as long tide, what emerges in our perceptual field is a radiance. That seems to come from nowhere and return to nowhere, whose ground is dynamic stillness. Hongzi continues, its brightness inherently purifying, transcends causal conditions. And this brings us back to Yap yesterday. It's not about cause and effect here. It transcends causal conditions. Beyond subject and object, subtly but preserved, illuminated, and vast, it also cannot be spoken of as being or non-being. Oh, did any of that resonate somewhere? You must understand again that Hongzi is not making concepts here. He is trying to describe his direct perceptual experience. Yes? Please understand that. Another wonderful image. Isn't it? I mean, it's humbling. I mean, the Hubble telescope is such a gift, you know. It's such a gift of technology. Technology can bring us to other places. It doesn't usually. When I bop around with my iPod, it feels good though, you know. Isn't that beautiful? The light, the vibration, the intentionality. Moving through from the moment of the Big Bang, if that's how things happen, there has been a creative intention generating form, a vast creative intention emerging from source. Call it what you like. But this is creation. This is creativity. This is something that holds intentionality. And intentionality is what drives evolution, you know, not genes. Have you come across Rodolfo Linus's book, The Eye of the Vortex? Very, very good book. It's about the neurobiology of selfhood and how a self-referential core is generated in the brain. But what he does, he is quite beautiful. He says, you know, that the ability to know oneself is a property of the cell. It's not just a property of the brain. We are whole beings. And he says, you know, if you go back to the primordial ooze when the single cell emerged from the ooze, that cell had agency. That cell had intentionality. It had need. It had the need to survive. It had the need to move and explore and learn and develop. That intention to move, to survive, to learn, to develop is what drove evolution. Genes are not proactive. They respond to conditions. They're conditional. It's intentionality that drives our life. Very Buddhist. The Buddha said it's through intention that all is created. And it's through intention that we can be healed. Very powerful. So we should be very aware of what we intend, because all that can be unconscious, you know. Isn't this a beautiful image of a star being born again? Isn't that extraordinary? I'm sorry, I love this stuff. I don't. And also I seek principles. I seek in whether it's research work, whether it's imagery, the principles of the work we do. And one of the important principles in Craniosacral is the understanding of the generation of form. And form is generated by the action of forces. And the way that the breath of life manifests form is really very straightforward, very deep and very straightforward. In order for a form to be generated, a fulcrum must be organized. You have to generate a fulcrum for a form to be generated. The fulcrum begins to manifest the field of action. So you need a fulcrum, and a field of action can start to manifest. If our sun was not born, there would be no life here on earth. That fulcrum of our sun had to be created. Had to be created for life to be created. And the breath of life and the source that it emerges from is very patient. Very patient. It is beyond time. Space is very important here. So here we have the concept and the reality of the fulcrum and the field, organizing a field. Similar thing. And we also understand that from a fulcrum emerges a midline in complex organisms. And the midline is a principle of organization. Here we have a midline forming a field and a fulcrum, and we have fields within fields. Life is fields within fields within fields. Life is nonlinear, it is holographic. And by the way, Genesis didn't happen back then, it's happening now. In this very moment, you can find your origin. You don't have to go back then. Now is origin. Now is origin. That's why the work we do is so powerful, because the healing is now. It's not about the past. It's not about unwinding something from the past. It's about the present action of forces now. And the work we do in both the cranial field and the psychotherapy field is largely perceptual in nature. We learn to attune, we learn to generate a holding environment that allows motion and relationship to emerge. We learn to generate safety and trust because of the nature of where we are in ourselves, and that's a big thing for us to learn. Because we have to learn about ourselves. If we're going to hold another human being safely and in trust, we have to hold ourselves safely and in trust. So that's a huge learning process. And if you don't take it on, you can't really hold that field for another person at depth. Yeah? You have to take yourself on. And believe me, it's a journey. We all know that. I'm still bloody taking myself on. Another wonderful image of the creative intention. I think I'd like to read with this. I'd like to read one more from the Tao Te Ching. That might be enough from it, but I love the Tao Te Ching. I studied it, somewhat of it in Chinese. I've collected all the English versions of it. Dao ke Dao fei cheng Dao. The Tao that can be Taoed, the Tao that can be fragmented, the Tao that can be talked about is not the everlasting Tao. So those who speak don't know, so bear with me, please. Isn't that a wonderful image of creation again? From above it is not bright, from below it is not dark. It returns to nothingness. New physics. The form of the formless, the image of the imageless. It is called indefinable and beyond imagination. Can't even imagine it. Stand before it, and there is no beginning, because the beginning is now. Follow it, and there is no end, because there is no ending, because the end is now. All subatomic particles arise and return, has momentary existence. Follow it, and there is no end. Stay with the ancient Tao. Move with the present. We're being told by Lao Tzu, over 3,000 years ago, to be in the present. Knowing the ancient beginning in the primordial present is the essence of Tao, and it is the essence of healing. Isn't that wonderful? Bear with me. Again, more images from the Hubble. Here we have a planetary nebula, planets coalescing around the fulcrum, form coalescing around the field that is organized around the fulcrum. And we'll see there's vast centrifugal and centripetal forces at work, which we can directly perceive if our perceptual field is wide and deep and still enough. We can perceive those same forces organizing a human system. Isn't this a beautiful image? Again, a planetary system being formed around a fulcrum. Isn't that a wonderful image? A planetary system called the embryo. Yes? As above, so below. And as Yap said so beautifully, we are whole human beings. I came across these concepts of embryology a good 15 years ago now, when I came across Dr. Bleshmitz's work about the wholeness of, at every stage, we're a human being. At conception, we are a human being, whole and complete in and of ourselves, ready perhaps for our next stage of development, based on the conditions and the contingencies met. Again, vast space. Isn't that beautiful? Look at the forces at work there, and now look at that. Yes? That little ball of cells coming out of the fallopian tube into great space. Is that extraordinary? Is that extraordinary? There's a being in relationship to space. It's not just a thing. And here again, we have those beautiful imagery of the spiral galaxy. Vast spiraling forces at work, centripetal, inward spiraling forces to a fulcrum, centrifugal, outward spiraling forces in relationship to the fulcrum in dynamic equilibrium. In order for a form to be generated, dynamic equilibrium must be established. You all know that from your work, don't you? What is one of the main principles of the work? We hold an awareness and a relationship to universal forces through what Dr. Sutherland called primary respiration, as it manifests through long tide and through the fluid body as a field of intention. We hold an awareness of those universal forces while we also hold the conditional in our awareness. Carl Jung wrote beautifully about this. He said it's the role of the therapist, and thank you, Carl Jung, the role of the therapist to hold both universal and conditional forces in their awareness until they come to balance. And that's one of the most important aspects of the work. We seek dynamic equilibrium in the conditions present. And then he said, when balance is attained, the transcendent faculty, the transcendent function naturally arises. He didn't mean something mystical here. He meant in that state of balance, the system can transcend the conditions present and something else can happen. In other words, the energy economy can shift in the dynamic state of balance. So that's a principle you see throughout space-time and in all healing work. And isn't that wonderful? Isn't that extraordinary? Isn't that extraordinary? Now, this sort of takes me to the next step. So I wanted to get imagery that may stimulate a sense of source for us, a sense of source which is unspeakable and only known in the darkness of unknowing, as in that great Christian mystical text of the Middle Ages, the cloud of unknowing. We only know God in a state of unknowing, in the bare state of unknowing. And believe me, we only know anything in relationship to our clients when we unknow everything we think we know and enter that state of bare attention and awareness and unknowing. Subtle and beautiful words around this. Everything you know is important. You have to learn what you learn and slog through what you slog through. You have to know the particulars. But then it all goes behind the curtain. And you are there in a receptive state to the forces present. And the conditions emerge. And you as a therapist, me as a therapist, can never know what to do. Don't think you can know what to do, because then you will get in the way of something much deeper that can emerge in the present moment. The forces at work know what to do. We create the conditions where those forces may be able to manifest, but we must not get in the way of them. Can you understand that? Yes? I know you do. This brings us to how those forces manifest in form. And here's a tornado. And I was here 4 years ago, and I mentioned Victor Schauberger's work, which I've appreciated in the past. Victor Schauberger was an Austrian scientist, and he came from a family of foresters. So he spent a lot of time listening in the forest, watching water. And he realized that there are forces at work in the water that seem to be generative, creative, organizing forces. And Sutherland saw this. He talked about the process of ignition, where there is a shift in state, a transmutation, he called it, of these organizing forces directly into the fluids of the body. He called it the generation of potency, that which can do work and maintain organization and health. And this is from the idea of Victor Schauberger's work, where vast spiraling forces generate form. And here's a tornado. And a tornado has a huge uprising force in its center. It's just air, and it can tear buildings apart. Isn't that extraordinary when you think about that? And Schauberger came up with some beautiful images, which we've seen from Jim's presentation. Here we have the classic Schauberger field. And he said that the whole field starts to spiral into a midline. And an organizing field is generated. And you see very similar forms that you saw earlier in the morning. And the field is a function of inward spiraling forces to a fulcrum in midline and outward spiraling forces in dynamic equilibrium. And these generate an uprising force through the midline. And for those cranial practitioners who are aware of the uprising force through the notochord and the primitive streak, you can palpate that in a human being throughout life as an organizing principle. So here we have the Schauberger spiral. Fields within fields, spirals within spirals. And it's interesting, when you break that field down, you get interesting motion, which I'm sure you've all sensed in the field around a human being. Here we have the midline again, and field, which is that umbilical. Where's Catherine? We got to get the umbilicus in there. Thank you. And the motion of the field is very interesting. There are orbital spiraling motions at the core. There are rotational motions. And there are circulational motions, or Dr. Stone called them the long line pulsations, all generating form. And we'll see these kinds of forces at work all the time throughout life. Orbital spiral forces, rotational forces, longitudinal forces. And I'm showing you that for a reason. And this looks familiar. I must have the same book. And here he wrote, energy is primary, the cause, form is secondary, the effect. I don't like that so much, actually, because I'm not into cause and effect. I'm into origins in the present moment. which actually take us beyond cause and effect. I'm not saying there isn't cause and effect. If I do that, I'll get a headache. But there's something deeper within that. And I like I studied for many years with many Qigong teachers and had some quite extraordinary experiences. If I had time, I'd tell you a really good Kung Fu story that I witnessed, but we'll see if there's any time. And there's this thing in this understanding that I love, that struck me over 30 years ago, that struck me. It stopped me when my teacher, Master Ha, said this to me. He said that Qi follows Yi, energy follows intention, and Xing follows Qi, and form follows energy. Isn't that extraordinary? So energy follows intention, form follows energy. I really like that. And here we have those spiraling forces sculpting matter, sculpting shape and form. And energy sculpts form. Dr. Bleshmitz's work was quite extraordinary because when I started reading it, it amazed me. What he was saying was that there are forces within the fluids, very resonant with Dr. Sutherland's work, forces in the fluids that are organizing form. And as the cells differentiate and meet in various kinds of fields of action, the morphology of a human being is literally sculpted. And I think Dr. Sutherland would say sculpted by the breath of life. We're sculpted beings. We should stand here and people should look at each of us and say, we're beautiful sculptures, because we are. And it's again, I'm coming back, we're very resonant, I think. This is from Arthur Winfrey's work, and you saw some images earlier from his book, When Time Breaks Down. And here we have the energy field around the heart. He had a research grant to study the energy field around the heart in cardiac arrhythmia, where people's hearts would suddenly stop for, quote, no reason. And so he discovered a midline with what we would call automatically shifting fulcrums, Sutherland would call automatically shifting fulcrums, and field phenomena that he called scroll wave forms that begin to look very much like the Schauberger forms. And what he discovered was very fascinating and very important in the work that cranial people do, because most of you are craniotherapists, but it's true in psychotherapy also, that something shifts the field away from its midline, and the heart goes into arrhythmia. Could be a shock, could be a toxin. Something shifts the field away from its midline. Isn't that interesting? And we know in our work the importance of the midline and the organization of the field. Here's the torus shape. Now, Winfrey began to realize that the torus shape is a universal organizing form. He got another research grant to do research into biochemical reactions in the human body, in fluid, which was very interesting. And he used a certain reagent that actually showed you the motion of what was happening in the biochemical reaction. And no matter what he was investigating, the creation of a protein or whatever, the same form was seen over and over again. And here this is a computer-generated image where he's opened up that form, opened up the torus, and discovered that the physical entity, whether it's a protein or a hormone, at a deeper level has momentary existence, hence when time breaks down. That moment to moment things are being created. And that the form is held together by the field. The field is primary, and then the form can manifest. The field is primary, and then the form can manifest. And every form has a midline with rising, what he called phase singularities or organizing centers, automatic shifting fulcrums in the cranial field, organizing fields of action. And one of the wonderful perceptual processes that a cranial practitioner begins to appreciate is the nature of automatic shifting fulcrums, which are coalescences of potency within the field that organize fields of action and relate the field to the midline. And it's extraordinary to be able to perceive shifts in those relationships and healing processes occurring at every level, in the tissues, in the fluids, in the nervous system, etc. Is this okay? Are you with me? Here's just another image of the same. But it's an extraordinary, what Winfrey came to is that he believed everything is organized in these by these field phenomena. And of course, that's what Schauberger was also saying. And that brings us to these wonderful images that Catherine showed the other day from Alex Gray. And he's showing, Alex Gray is interesting because as a child, he just started to see all this. And then as he grew older, he started to paint it. So this is what he's trying to actually paint what he sees. Isn't that extraordinary? And here we have all of those kinds of energy pulsations and currents and fulcrums, which are classically called chakras in the yogic system, but they're organizing centers that allow form to maintain cohesion. Within fields within fields, and none of our fields are separate. At the level of being, which I hope I can get a little bit into, at the level of being, we are not separate. At the level of being, we are not separate. Isn't that, I think that's an extraordinary image of the grand matrix, matrices within matrices within matrices. Light. Well, that brings us to the inquiry of, okay, how does the field manifest a form? And Dr. Sutherland was very, very clear that the breath of life and the field phenomenon it generates, the long tide and its field phenomena locally, manifests in the fluids through what he called transmutation, through a step down, in Dr. Stone's words, of energy and force. And isn't that a beautiful image? And in that basic process of transmutation, of the intention held in the field manifesting in the fluids, each and every one of us becomes empowered to be here. Our basic empowerment is there from the moment we were conceived. And we never lose that. So I hope not one of you will go away from here feeling disempowered, because that's a terrible place to be in. And try and get out of the victim's position in that, because in the basic core of your being, you are empowered to be here. I'll read something else from the Tao Te Ching that kind of moves me. Great De, sometimes pronounced as Te, Great De, which is usually translated as virtue, but it means empowerment. Great empowerment appears flowing from Tao. Our very being is empowered to be here by the forces that are here. Tao in action, only vague and intangible and vague, yet within it are images. Shadowy and obscure, yet within it is essence. Essence so real that within it is true potency. That's Lao Tzu using the term potency. That's how it was translated. So we're empowered to be here, and this process of transmutation that occurs in the fluids. And I don't know if Dr. Emoto's here, but when I first saw his images, I was really touched, really touched by the crystalline nature of the fluids and how water holds and manifests information. And that's happening within us now. And water is holding an expression of our consciousness, of our empowerment, of the essence of who we are as shape and form. So here we have kind of polluted water, and here we have water from Lourdes. Isn't that beautiful? So dependent on the conditions, form is manifesting. And this is wonderful from Dr. Emoto's work. before and after sending love. Before and after prayer. Isn't that extraordinary? But it's like this. It's like this. Life can change like that. Yeah? An intention forms in your mind, and life can change like that. Can you understand that? It's hard, it's taken me years to get that. Come on, Franklyn. Wake up. I'm still trying, believe me. And this made me laugh. I'm sorry. Heavy metal and Mozart. What can I say? Is there a value judgment here? I don't know. This is from the work of Theodor Schrank. Schrank, where he's an anthroposophist. Thank you, anthroposophist. Oh, God. I'm from New York. What do you expect? Let's take a breath. That was for me. Is it? And he introduced forces through oil into water, and look at the shapes that are generated. It looks like the embryo, doesn't it? Looks like an embryo forming. Look at that, little face and eyes, midline. Isn't that extraordinary? Water, manifesting intentionality. Look at that. If you were to show me that and not tell me what it was, I would say, oh, wow. Images of the embryo, Isn't that extraordinary? So water is very important. And actually, Schauberger was very worried about how we treat water as human beings, how we change water flow in the world, what we do with water, how we pollute water. He was very worried about the natural world. And of course, there we have a real embryo. Isn't that wonderful? Flow forms embryo, manifesting intention and creation as a whole. Beautiful images. Here we have, look how large the heart is. We're big-hearted creatures if we allow ourselves to be, And here's Catherine's umbilicus. I'm going to call this Catherine's umbilicus from now on. And here we are. We're a fluid being. We're developed. We're generated in fluid and water. We're 85% fluid. We're fluid beings. Our fluid body is primordial. This fluid body was here from the beginning. And in the work as we teach it now, I'm not so tissue oriented. I really, the tissue fluid field is whole. As Jim was saying this morning, we're a fluid tissue matrix as a whole. And you hold a wide perceptual field, you settle in, you orient to that fluid nature of who we are, and the forces begin to manifest at that level to your perceptual field. It's not that they're not there. And I love this image because here we are beings born in the cosmos. We are beings born in the cosmos. And each and every one of us is suspended in the universe right now. We're suspensory beings. We are suspended in the universe right now. And I am not separate from that. You are not separate from that. We are not separate from each other. We are luminous beings. I'd like to talk a little bit about the nature of being. Next. I'm doing pretty well here, I think, actually. In time. And space. Knowledge, we'll see. That wonderful book by Tartang Tukul Rinpoche, Time, Space, and Knowledge. Extraordinary piece of work. For a long time, ever since I realized I was mad, totally nuts, well, I tell you, in 1969, I was in Georgetown Medical School, sitting in the library, looking at this bloody page of histology, and I looked at it, 5 bloody days later, I was looking at the same page of histology. I couldn't get past that page. Why? I only realized after, because it didn't make any sense to me. I was looking at death, not life, in those preparations. It didn't make sense to me. And the more I looked at it, the more depressed I got. I didn't realize that, but that's what was happening. Of course, what my basic anxiety depressive system was stimulated, but there you go. That's another story. So at that point, I was sent to see an analyst by my sister, actually. And I went 3 times a week. I was supposed to see him 4 times a week, but he said, okay, 3 times a week. Monday, Wednesdays, Fridays, for about 9 or 10 months. And actually, it was wonderful. It was the first experience I had, and he was one of these modern avant-garde young kind of analysts, right? It was the first experience I had of someone simply being receptive and listening and just non-judgmentally holding me. What a gift. Because as we go on, we will see that that's a critical thing to have in place in our early life. That quality of holding, of being received at the level of your being. Not your self-system. Your self-system is mad. You're all mad, at that level. But at the level of your being, you're pristine. You're whole. You're never unwhole. And that got me off on this whole journey, really. And I'd like to read something from Martin Heidegger. And of course, I'm reading the English translation. I had the funniest experience. I was teaching a course in Zurich, and I was reading the English translation, which was then translated back into German. There's something very spiral and wonderful about that, I'm sure. So what I'd like you to do is take a breath and really settle into see if there's some stillness, and open your receptive field to Heidegger's words. Heidegger marveled. He marveled. Why is there something as opposed to nothing? Why are there beings as opposed to nothing? This set him off on his whole philosophical journey. And then he writes here, listen to this is extraordinary. The wonder is that a world is worlding around us at all. The wonder is that a world is worlding around us at all. That there are beings rather than nothing. That things are and we ourselves are in their midst. That things are and we ourselves are in their midst. That we ourselves are, and yet barely know who we are, and barely know that we do not know all of this. Isn't that wonderful? Isn't that wonderful? So that really sets me off on a journey of the nature of being. For Heidegger, it set him off on 3 basic inquiries. The first was the first question, or 3 basic questions. Why are there beings as opposed to nothing? Well, there are beings. We are. There is. By being, he meant existence. In me, in this present moment, lives existence. I am. That's what he was talking about. And that led him to the second question. What does it mean to be? Many of us seek that in our life. We seek meaning in our life. We do it in all sorts of ways, sometimes very distorted ways, but we seek meaning. We're beings who seek meaning. And that led him to a third, very important clinical question, in my mind, in the context of this human being in history and time. What does it mean to be? Because that meaning may be different from your meaning. Can you understand that? It's contextualized. It's contextualized. In Buddhism and Taoism, the very interesting thoughts about being. There's a sutra of the Buddha from the Pali Canon called the Anguttara Sutta. Extraordinary sutta. There's a group of monks and nuns sitting there with him. And in his presence, a number of them realized truth. Now, realization can occur through transmission. When you sit with a being who is really in a depth of spiritual presence, if you're at all tuned in, you enter that field with them. It's field to field. And I have had that experience. Both Maura and I studied with an extraordinary being from Upper Burma who taught through transmission in the stillness. Extraordinary. And so when the Buddha saw or perceived that a number of these beings realized truth, he smiled. And he didn't say John or Mary was free. He said chitta is free. Now, this word chitta is very interesting because it's usually used to mean mind or mental states. But here he meant it in a different way. He said, at the root of who we are, chitta is luminous and free. At the root of who we are luminous beings who are free. In this very moment, we are free. At the level of our being, we are free, and that freedom is never lost. You do not have to try to be free. You are already free. That freedom is here. It's inherent. The question is, how does that luminosity and freedom become obscured to our everyday mind? That's the question. We don't have to make ourselves free. You can't. You're already free. So we're luminous and empowered beings. From Tao, we are empowered to be. So that's a grand, sweeping, deep understanding of what it means to be a human being. And I'd like to look more in the psychological field, because not many people are talking about the psychological field here. And I think it's very important, because what I see sometimes in healing fields is a shadow. And it's the shadow of selfhood. It's the shadow when self and self-form is not appreciated, where we think that we can come under ourself and it's not going to be actualized in relationship. Yeah? You can't. You have to hold your self-forms in awareness. You don't have to do much with it, but you have to hold it in awareness if you're really going to truly be there for another. So I like the psychological world because it helps me perceive my tight places, what gets in the way of relating, where I get scared, what is the meaning of that in me. It brings me to that third question of Heidegger, in me. Yeah? And Ronald Fairbairn was an analyst, and he was really an interesting guy. I've kind of torn apart his work in the last 2 or 3 years. I mean, but in reading, torn apart, along with others. And really try to get out of his analytical language, because he was talking to analysts. The tricky thing with him is that he meant completely different things than Freud did by the same words. Freud, Klein, any psychotherapists here? I'm wondering. So a fair number of therapists. Good. Freud and Klein, for Freud and Klein, we're inherently split beings. We're inherently split. We're lost before we start. And the best you can do is appreciate your depressive position, and just get on with life. Well, Fairbairn, the Buddha had this sidekick called Ananda. And every now and then, Ananda would say something, and the Buddha would say not so, Ananda. And then he would explain how it was. Well, Fairbairn said, say not so, Sigmund. Say not so. Oh, no. We are originally whole. We are whole. And we're not driven by instinct. No, we're beings who are in connection, who seek other beings. We are inherently relation-seeking beings. And Frank Lake, another analyst who is the father of pre- and perinatal psychology, had some beautiful stuff to say. I'm translating his words a bit. But he said, as a human being, we seek the other to know the nature of our own being and to know the nature of the world we find ourselves in. And we feel ourselves through our world. Self is a felt experience and organized through the regulation of affect and feeling tone. I can't get into all that. But it's beautiful. Original ego is the word he used, is inherently relation-seeking. But, what is whole isn't ego or self, it's our very being. It's our very being. And that wholeness was there in the conceptus, as Yap so elegantly described yesterday, and it's there throughout life. And Lake talked about the basic needs of being. And these aren't self-needs. In that relation-seeking, we seek recognition, acknowledgement, and unconditional acceptance at the level of our being. I don't mean accepting someone's bad behavior or something like that. And it's been very helpful for me as a father to differentiate. So, my older Laura would do something that was off the wall, and I had two choices. I could go, Laurel, you're off the wall. That was stupid. Stop doing that. Or I could say to her, oh, that's dangerous. When you did that, that scared me. Yeah. Can you please stop doing that? Yeah. Because I wasn't making her wrong. I wasn't destroying her at the level of her being. Can you understand that? Behavior is one thing, but at the level of being, we seek recognition and unconditional acceptance. And your clients will seek that. Unconsciously, they will seek that as they see you. And you have to hold that field of unconditional acceptance. Carl Rogers' great work. You enter a field of acceptance. And here we come back to source, being, and self. And we find in everyday life, and very much in the therapeutic relationship, axes of relationship. Being arises from source, and we might be with each other at a being-to-being level. And that happens naturally. This isn't, you don't have to go into great spiritual meditative states for this. You go into a coffee shop with a dear friend who you haven't seen for 5 years. You settle down, and usually you're initially in self-to-self kind of relationship, and you're blabbing and stuff, and the little anxiety's coming out. And then as there's a quality of holding for each other, and a recognition, and a receptive, safe, trustworthy field is there for both of you, you start to settle. Maybe it takes 10 minutes, maybe 15 minutes, and you start to settle out of your conditional self forms, and you you enter that being-to-being place. Where there's, how many of you have experienced that with friends, dear ones, family? Of course you have. It's natural to us. Now, in therapeutics, you want to enter a being state. I would like you to. I'd recommend that. Get out of your self forms. There is a sacrifice, as Michael Shea so lovely points us to. We have to sacrifice our ego. We have to sacrifice ourself and enter a being state where there is a natural being-to-being resonance. And as I settle there with a client and enter my being state and hold a wide perceptual field, become aware of the presence of primary respiration and settle, a resonance begins to occur where a shift occurs in their system and they begin to move into that being-to-being space with me. And a shift occurs in their system from conditions and forms and fulcrums and inertia to primary respiration. And it's a beautiful thing to be with. And that may take 6, 7 sessions sometimes to occur in that holding environment that you create. It's the same in psychotherapy. In core process work, we orient to the universal through bodhicitta, the Brahma Viharas, illimitable states of consciousness, the flow of compassion. We orient to the person and their process, and a settling occurs. Same principle. If something is true, it manifests at every level in all ways. Yeah? It's a healing principle. And so innate being, inherent being, which is an expression of sentience, the basic sentience which is there right at conception. Sentience, existence, seeks other beings. Innate being seeks relationship with other beings in order to know itself and to learn about the nature of the world it finds itself in. We're inherently relation-seeking beings. And you know, because of that, our greatest wounds are relational in nature. Our greatest wounds aren't that I fell down and broke my hip. Okay, I'll have to deal with that. But the greatest wound is at the level of my being. I was not received and seen. And boy, will a defended self-system begin to arise from that kind of wounding. Yeah. So, early relational milieu. There's been a lot of research around this because of the attachment field, which is a great gift. The relational field as a safe holding environment. The term safe holding environment comes from the work of Donald Winnicott, wonderful analyst. He did these wonderful BBC radio programs on the mother-infant relationship, which were brilliant, way before Bowlby stuff became known, about the importance of holding a safe relational field and holding the little one in a way that they're not impinged upon, so that their emotional states and their affects can be regularized within a safe holding field. So that, in his words, it's extraordinary, so that they can simply be, have the experience of being, knowing their own being. And then a self begins to form that's not so rigid, that's not so defended. And he said that, you know, if we're held in a safe and empathetic field in a good enough way, none of us are perfect, you know, none of us are perfect, in a good enough way, then that little being can learn about the nature of its own being, and without having to defend too soon, without having to form a defensive system too soon. So then the self that begins to form is more fluid. It can cope with conditions. And in his words, a continuous and coherent state of being begins to emerge within the self structure. Isn't that lovely? And it's largely based on attunement, resonant, and appropriate response. That's what we do as clinicians. We attune to the universal and the conditional, we resonate, and there's an appropriate response. There is not one bloody thought in my mind when I'm with a client. I don't have the slightest idea what needs to be done. But the appropriate responses emerge in response to the conditions that emerge. And I can never know what to do. I can never know what needs to happen. I learned this a long time ago. In 1985, I had a very busy practice in central London. A guy was referred to me by an osteopath in the practice who had a very bad sacroiliac pain. He was hobbling. It was going on for 6 months. He had seen everything and done everybody. Actually, it was over a year. So he came to see me. And we settled down. I found the position that he could rest in. We negotiated our relational field, which is extremely important for the relational field to settle, for a sense of trust to begin to emerge. Why in the world would someone lie down on my table? They're mad. They don't know who I am. We have to develop trust. Can you understand that? And that takes time. Also, it's about the state of your inner being, how you orient to that. And so anyway, I quickly realized that his system was in shock. There's all sorts of things going on. It's been like this for a long time. And I wanted to do some first aid work, try to alleviate the pain. But then I realized, but everyone else has been doing this. Everyone else has been doing this. So what I did was I started to learn about receptivity, and I just settled. We negotiated contact. I settled. I tried to orient to primary respiration, but there was so much shock in his system. It took 5 or 6 sessions for his system to settle under the shock and for it to begin to process. And once that occurred, I was in awe, as I settled back into a receptive field, watching the breath of life, the long tide, the forces within the fluids take over. I could have never known for that sacroiliac pain to heal. The first thing that had to be attended to was his thoracic vertebra. And then there was a shift to his occiput. And then there was a shift to a cranial base pattern. And then there was a shift. And then some neural activity was cleared. Then there was a settling into a stillness. And then maybe 4 or 5 sessions later, the potency chose to work on that sacroiliac joint. I could have never known that sequence of events. Yeah? Dr. Sutherland was not kidding when he said that this work is beyond human mentality. So self forms in the milieu of the affects generated by moment-to-moment relational exchange. So as we, as prenates and little beings after birth, we have moment-to-moment relational exchange. We feel that impact within us, and self begins to organize around the feeling impact of moment-to-moment relational exchange. A lot of research has been carried out in that territory. And I'd like to read this little quote, which is from the Hindu tradition, and it's about the field we enter when we're born. Yeah? Garuda is a mythic god bird. Yeah? Garuda flew and remembered it was only a few days since he had hatched from his egg, and already so much had happened. Who was the first person he'd seen? His mother, Vinata. Beautiful in her tininess, she sat on a stone watching his egg hatch. Determinedly receptive at the level of being. Hers was the first eye Garuda held in his own, and at once he knew that that eye was his own. He saw himself in the relationship with the other. He knew the nature of his own being in the reflection of the being of the other. Deep inside was an ember that glowed in the breeze, the same he could feel burning beneath his own feathers, the ember of his own being. Isn't that beautiful? And boy, here we are. Here is an extraordinary being seeking relationship. So here we have the blastocyst seeking to implant in the uterus. Thank you to Nielsen for all this. But look at this. What's this? What's this? This being is seeking relationship. There is a knowing that if my existence does not meet and be received by the existence of another, I will die. And this little being puts out a little foot, a little gelatinous foot, and sticks itself to the other. There's no chemicals involved here. There's intentionality here. Can you understand that? Isn't that extraordinary? Right from the beginning, we seek the other for safety, so we can grow and be nurtured, and so that we can know ourselves. Isn't that extraordinary? A little foot. We glue ourselves to the other. Of course, well, I won't get into that. Look at this. Is this mind-blowing? Caesarean birth. This changed this physician's life because he wrote about this. I forget his name now. As he was doing the caesarean section, this little hand came out and grabbed his finger. Can you see that? And he, the physician, burst into tears. Good man. And he said it changed his life, and he'll never treat these little ones the same way. He realized that they're sentient beings. You know, he said just take them out and put them there and do what he needs to do. Yeah? These are beings seeking relationship right from the beginning. Isn't that extraordinary? What heartwarming things that we are. Okay. Well, there's a whole section I'm not going to get to, obviously, because I wanted to talk about, we're radiant, luminous beings, so what happens? So I wanted to talk about what happens, how that gets obscured, Have I 5-10 minutes to do that? Yeah. So we'll do a little bit. So what happens? I'm a luminous being, yeah. Oh my goodness. Sometimes I don't act like that. So what happens? Well, Fairbairn, who was very Buddhist in his observations, said, the field we are created in the womb, and the field we meet after birth is inherently ambiguous. It has to be. That's the root of what is called dukkha in Buddhism. the roots of suffering. Life has to be polarized for there to be form. Relationship is polarized. Sometimes our needs are met, sometimes we feel seen, sometimes mommy's there, sometimes daddy's angry. It's ambiguous. It's not good or bad, it's just how it is. And in that basic ambiguity, the little one can't differentiate on an emotional level what's me and what's them. He called that primary identification, because the little one feels its world as is whole. And mother's feelings are her feelings or his feelings, and vice versa. There's an interchange. Franklin called it the womb of spirit. So after birth, you're still in the womb of spirit with the primary other for at least 6 months after birth. And this gives rise to affect, to feeling tone in the little one, and charge. And that's sensed as relational goodness and badness. Sometimes this feels good, and sometimes this feels crap. Yeah? And you start to organize your sense of the world in relationship to your experience of relationship. And so internal self-territories are generated to manage the experience of basic ambiguity and the related affects generated. And one result of that are different kinds of attachment systems. But it's what's happening internally that's what's important. Yeah? And Fairborn went on to say, I won't get into all that because there's not quite enough time, but he said something very, very beautiful. What starts to coalesce are territories of selfhood. He called it the splitting of the self. So we begin to organize a central self that deals with the ambiguity and the relational wounding in certain ways. Another territory starts to organize that he called the rejecting self or rejecting ego, that part of a self that needs to protect against further wounding. And another part of ourselves organizes that's very needy from the affront of the wounding and tends to cling to relationships even when they're not healthy. And so he talked about the dynamics of the push-pull, the energy dynamics. He also said you must understand that ego is energy. He was very ahead of his time. Ego is energy, he said. Ego is libido. Ego is energy. And the brain generates energetic forms through oscillation resonance. Linus was very fascinating about how the self forms through neuronal oscillation. Very interesting. Moment to moment. And of course, the great gift in all that is that moment to moment we can heal ourselves because nothing is fixed. And that's the great gift of the Buddha to me. The knowledge that there's a ground of openness, and within that, everything has moment-to-moment existence. And if I can be with that in the present, there is possibility again. Shall we take a breath? I'll finish there. Okay. Thank you very much. I take it that there's any time for questions or anything?
You can take a few questions. Yeah.
Good. Okay, I take 2 questions? Good. Yeah. I was just told that I actually have time for 2 questions. So shall we take a breath and just see what resonated and if anything emerges from that? Yeah, Manos.
Yes. Concerning this first paragraph there, the early relational field is inherently ambiguous. There are degrees of ambiguity.
Absolutely.
And there are traditions of minimal ambiguity. And the wishable is to have the wishable, I mean, the aim for our societies would be to manage to have the most little of ambiguity in this, because the way you show it there, by calling it inherently, it might mean that it has to be the ambiguity. So
that's really important what you're saying. And if we take that to the next couple of slides, which I haven't been able to get to, what is really important here in our early development is the nature and quality of the holding field, the field we are held in. And the more and more tuned and empathetically resonant that field is, the less that ambiguity becomes a tension in the field. And the more I can rest in being. So what you're saying, that's the key to it. That's the key. And it's a lot about education and knowledge and understanding. And if that's held in a good enough way, then that little being doesn't have to come out of its being. And the self that coalesces then has the opportunity to be a fluid and grounded selfhood that has at its core a sense of being. Yeah, so that's absolutely right. So thank you. Anyone else resonate with anything? Someone? Okay, thank you.
Hello, my name's Pam.
Hi, Pam.
Not being a craniosacral therapist, I've not come across the term the long field before. Would you be able to cover that briefly, please?
You mean
the long field.
The long tide.
Long
tide.
Tide, yes.
Very briefly. It would take us a few seminars to get there. But basically, the idea of the long tide, or the perception of the long tide, because again, these are words given to perception. These are not concepts that someone thought out. Dr. Becker came up with the term long tide. As you settle into a still and present center, and allow your midline to connect, and you widen your perceptual field without losing orientation to the client's midline and system, and you widen and settle and deepen, and allow your mind to settle in its receptive state. You know, it's very beautiful. You don't have to stop your mind. Just enter a receptive state, and the mind naturally quietens. And when the mind enters a state of balance, where its sensory and motor functions seem to come to balance, this incredible thing happens. This is kind of bzzz, and your whole mind opens. And as your mind opens, it moves towards the horizon and you settle. And you have the experience of the long tide moving very slowly in 50-second cycles from the horizon to the midline of that client. And you can start to feel the generative winds that the Tibetans talk about. The long tide generates all those beautiful fulcrums and midlines and field phenomena that we talk about. It is a manifestation of the intention of the breath of life. And you actually sense all that. And it's but your mind has to be very slow and still and resonant with that level of perception. You have to come into synchrony with it, basically. And what you perceive are organizing forces at an incredible depth level that gives you a direct experience that we are indeed suspended in the universe, and we are indeed created moment to moment by that universal creative intention that the long tide mediates. And the long tide is stable. I don't have time to show you the slime mold video. This is an incredible video of research in the 1950s that shows the long tide in action in a primordial organism in 50-second cycles. It's beautiful. But you can sense that directly with another human being, and as you resonate and deepen, you don't have to do anything. The beauty is it's not a question of manipulating tissues or unwinding things. The forces begin to resonate and take over, and the long tide emerges. The forces manifest through the fluid tide and through the fluids themselves. And you can perceive all this happening in resonance. It's quite, and at the very most, you're creating a container. Perhaps you're augmenting natural processes that are already emerging, but it's largely through resonance with these tidal forces. Sutherland called it the tide. He was talking about the primary respiration's long tide. I don't know if that made any sense at all, but it's a formative organizing principle. The Tibetans call it, and the Tibetans have turned up every stone of consciousness and looked under it just to see what was under it, really. And they call it the unconditioned winds of the vital forces. Yeah? Schauberger called it the original motion. That's all long tide. So it's a motion oriented to the person's midline and fulcrum and pulsatory field that maintains that field so being can incarnate in form. This whole thing is here so that being can incarnate. You know, so that we, soul, our soul nature, our spirit, our being nature, this is all set up so we can be here. Thank you. It's true. It's extraordinary. Don't live it. Don't just don't, live it. We have to live that. Yeah. So it's a formative organizing force that's very stable. It is never in shock. It underlies everything in terms of the generation of form. Yeah. With an incredibly brief, but the cool thing, and I have to finish with this, I guess. You know what's wonderful? That human perception is deep, and it's not based on neural connections. That's based on existence within me itself. That our human perception is based on the very fact of sentience, and that is what allows this all to come into our perceptual field. So thank you, and thank you all.